Alright, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Safety Extreme cast for the week of November 7th, 2021. We've officially turned our clocks around, so hopefully everyone is wide awake or, just waking up for the first time for our day today. But I am Josh Bycer from Game Wisdom, and join me, my co host from soon to be title unnamed Nexus Games, Sharky.
Oh, it's currently titled Unnamed Nexus Games. Soon to be titled Known, hopefully. We're still playing with that, but
You could
I
go.
think we're close.
You could go the Untitled Goose Game round. It'd be Untitled Shark Game.
You mean Untitled Shark Studio?
There you go. But welcome everybody as always, and hi Mike in Shark's chat. So we are on part 3 of our What is a Game series. We're going to be talking about the design and elements of some of the more popular genres in the industry. And for this part, we are talking the action genre. So that is going to be 2D, 3D, and of course the transition into soulslikes. It is a kind of a confusing genre, considering how much of it kind of weaves into action-adventure, Metroidvania style design. And it is an important distinction I think we need to make, right?
Yeah. But they're I feel like the Souls game is a branch directly off from action game kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of the characteristics are the same. It's just really, I think the biggest thing is the whole blocking system and such, block parry, that kind of stuff. I think that's really the main thing that really differentiates it from normal action games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and kind of like the evolution of more like RPG based elements and even the growth of mechanics over the course of play became indicative of action adventure Souls like design. Whereas when we talk about most action games, there really isn't that huge of an evolution from beginning to end.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the action games are, very much um a lot of things we've seen in the arcades kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But and they're pretty similar nowadays too. They may not be designed to eat your quarters like the arcade
Mm-hmm.
ones were, but relatively same design wise. Although I you could say a Souls game was designed to eat your quarters.
Mm. I think it was designed to eat your soul.
Yeah, it eats your quarters and your soul. Your
Mm-hmm.
soul's quarters.
Yep. And the action genre and beat 'em ups are very like close together, at least in the older days of things. But we will be focusing more on beat 'em ups when we get into kind of fighting games, and I think that's going to be either the next part or the part after that, according to our list.
I don't think we're talking about it with fighting games necessarily, but I mean it is a separate topic.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Now, when we look at kind of the history of action games, it really began or it gave root at the arcade genre, as Shark said, with the likes of Contra, Metal Slug, and just all these games designed around we're going to fill the screen with death. Good luck with trying to stop it.
Yeah. Very, very limiting to where you could actually move.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of thing.
And when things kind of transitioned into the consoles, the design kept again with this kind of very over the top focus. They were meant to be quarter crunchers when there weren't any quarters to be had.
Did money go away at that point?
You couldn't put quarters in your Nintendo to get extra lives.
I mean, you could. It's called a Game Genie.
But
It just cost a lot of quarters to get a Game Genie.
But when we talk about pure action gameplay, this is again one of my bread and butter genres because it is a genre, or at least for the most part, that is divorced from RPG progression. If there is any kind of growth or change, it is usually kept either very incremental or it's oftentimes second or third to the experience. You can, find 100% of the items on Super Metroid or get all the power-ups in, a game like ActRaiser, Soul Blazer, and so on. But at the end of the day, if you're not good at the general core gameplay loop, none of that matters.
What about ActBlazer? I meant, when were you? Tell us about that game.
That's the fourth secret game from what was it? What was the name of the studio that did it?
I don't remember.
Me neither. Let's see. They were
Is that
Quintet.
game on fire?
What was that?
Is that game on fire?
Yep. But the design of these games was really about, again, how well can you manipulate your character? And there's kind of essentially, again, these three distinct periods of the action genre. You have the 2D action, which was basically arcade to arguably the N64, maybe PlayStation 1 era. Then you had 3D action, and then you had Souls-like. And Souls-like is still considered the new hotness when we talk about action games.
Yeah. So let's start with action games because I think we're going to, if we started with any of the others, I think we'd just be repeating ourselves when we came back to this one. So I think that the action game has the core to everything else, kind of thing, the 2D action games.
At least when it comes to the general moment-to-moment gameplay. When we got into 3D with the rise of God of War, Devil May Cry, and so on, we did see some evolutions there, but you can definitely trace the DNA back to 2D action. So again, there were a lot of these games released during the NES and SNES era. Most people know, of course, of the Contras. Let's see, I'm trying to think of a few other big name examples. We wouldn't necessarily consider Metroid, I think, in this case, as we're going to be saving that for the Metroidvania talk. But yeah, the original Castlevanias, of course, would be considered action games as well. And the action genre, at least when it came to 2D, oftentimes was very much, merged with platforming. Because again, platformer was the most predominant genre in the game industry for, we could easily say, over a decade in terms of all the games that were built on that kind of framework.
Yeah, but I think one important game you missed is Metal Slug.
Oh, I did mention that when we got to talking about the arcades. But yeah, Metal Slug, Gunstar Heroes, Rise Star, Treasure just made a lot of action games during the 90s. And while these games did have movement tech, jumping, and so on, they were still focused on how can you kill as many enemies as possible. It's the difference between, again, Mario and Metal Slug. Mario is more focused on platforming, with dealing with the enemies as secondary, whereas Metal Slug is the opposite. Until the day we get that dream game of Mario running around with a machine gun and a shotgun, killing Koopa Troopers.
Didn't Peter make that game?
Probably. And 2D action design is definitely about how well can you mitigate the threats around you. Of course, one of the most famous examples would be the Mega Man franchise. Mega Man, of course, I think definitely lean more towards platforming as an obstacle compared to some of the other action games we've seen. But
Mm.
it's still a game where your core gameplay loop involves shooting bad guys.
Yeah, Mega Man is a action game with a side of platforming
Mm-hmm.
or plateforming, as we
Yeah.
call it here.
Mm-hmm. But platforming is not a requirement when it comes to action games. And we've
Yeah,
seen some action games that forego jumping. Some of them may turn the jump button into like a slide or a dash button. You, of course, had something like Bionic Commando, where instead of jumping, you did your little grapple arm and you had to like swing around and jump like that.
yeah. What was that indie game that you played not too long ago? I think it was probably 6 months, a year ago, kind of thing when
Mm-hmm.
you played it. Maybe less than that, where it was cyberpunk themed and you were moving around and there was enemies coming out. There was um, a boss, I think, with like a chainsaw or something at the end of the first like map or something.
Mm-hmm.
Had the really cool looking cars that you kind of intro drove in on,
Mm-hmm.
and then you'd blow up the car. You could blow up. I think you could blow up the cars. I don't remember. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
No, not with that.
It was an action game, obviously.
Did I play like a demo or was it the full game?
I'm unsure.
Hmm.
You might have played both.
Hmm. I know the game that I played with the grapple arm. I don't think that's the one that you're talking about.
I don't know. Just think of action cyberpunk games that you played.
Was it the Anno Mutationum one? The one that
Maybe
had like an anime girl with like a sword fighting everything?
that's not the one I was thinking about, but
Ah.
that one worked too.
Hey, Smoke, how are you doing?
I was just trying to get more examples of action games out here.
Hmm. And again, like the action genre, along with platforming, have become bread and butter for indie developers. Shovel Knight, Odalis, Locomelito, and so on.
Yep. Hello, Smoke.
Now, the problem though is that, as with platforming, good action gameplay is a lot harder than it sounds in terms of trying to design it. Because we've seen plenty of bad action games here.
Yeah. When it comes to anything, I think that whenever it comes to any game that is reflex based,
Mm-hmm.
the code itself, the everything that goes into the game is easy to do, but getting the feel of the
Mm-hmm.
game is very hard to do and takes a lot of tweaking, tuning, and all this other stuff. And then you have to program and all these extra systems that just handle tweaks and everything, and then it becomes a lot more complicated, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Feel in action games or action based design is notoriously more important than anything else, especially if we compare
Mm.
it to, the very best RPG games. And I often wonder if that's one of the reasons why we saw this greater adoption of RPG mechanics and systems over the last decade, kind of as a crutch in terms of, you know, you don't need as much good game feel or be as much reflex space if you can just give a character, plus 10 sword or plus 6 armor that will, just counter all the enemies.
That could be, into when you're combining genres,
Mm-hmm.
but it could also be just that, RPGs were awesome, and, want more awesomeness. So, like, everybody decided to, basically adopt part of RPGs kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, almost every genre after RPGs, almost every one of them took on RPG aspects to them, which was quite weird because RPGs were the phenomenon, which now most people completely ignore them, even though a lot of games took stuff from that genre.
Mm-hmm.
And It's really sad because it's my favorite genre.
But getting that perfect feel for an action game, again, when we talked about platformers, I believe that was last week, or 2 weeks ago, I was sick the previous week, that it really comes down to that feel. And feel is something you can't necessarily program in a vacuum or design in a vacuum. Like we've talked about before about the importance of being able to play games in terms of study and analysis. And if you're trying to build a reflex or action based design, you need to play examples of it. Because you really can't get the full story just watching footage of Devil May Cry or watching footage of God of War 2018.
Yeah. Well, the initial design can be done in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
But, all initial designs can be done in a vacuum kind of thing. But, you definitely need to get feedback and, on the feel of everything and have, many people hands-on, telling you what feels good, what doesn't kind of thing so that you can, continue your design because your design file does not start, it does not stop after you get the initial stuff done. You don't want to put things in so concretely in your design file that there's no room for changes. You've got to keep your design files safe for a stream. They got to be stiff and hard, yet flexible. Which the best example of that in nature is a spider web. It's very stiff and hard, but yet it's flexible and it's full of holes, kind of thing. So, there's all kinds of different ways you can move and whatnot a spider web to fit different systems inside those holes, kind of thing, and fill it out, kind of thing, until you have a whole game that feels good, kind of thing. But that filling in those holes are the stuff you do during feedback and all this other stuff. Bless you.
Thank you.
And so you can design the spider web in a vacuum. Everything after that needs to have lots and lots of hands-on, lots of feedback, lots of criticism, and lots of knowing how to take feedback properly.
Yeah. Because in an action-based design, if the actual moment-to-moment is lacking or doesn't feel good, there goes your entire game. No one wants to play a poorly defined action title, because we've seen plenty of them. And figuring out what makes your game good or bad is incredibly difficult to do. Because again, it not only depends on, what kind of experience you're trying to aim for, but also how that is conveyed and done by the player. Like, one of the more important questions you have to ask, can you interrupt enemies? It sounds like a very simple question, but it has been a linchpin for numerous action games over the past 20 years. And the reason why is that if you can interrupt an enemy, then attack speed matters more than anything else. Because if I can hit you before you hit me, I stun lock you, you die. If that is not an option, then you need to give the player another way of getting around attacks. Because if I'm attacking you and you can just attack me right through it, well, what am I supposed to do? Am I just supposed to tank that hit? So that means you need to create a defensive system. And if you want to create a defensive system, well, you need to make sure that is also as refined and polished as your action. Because if you have a game where you can't interrupt enemies and you have no real viable defense, your game is basically done, because people don't want to play a game where every fight they're going to end up losing no matter what.
Yeah. There are games that do both, right?
Oh, yes, definitely. There are a lot of games that have, normal enemies that you can stun, and then elites or special enemies that have super armor that you can't attack through. Hades did that. That they have elite enemies that would show up with a hyper armor or super armor that you can't stun until you knock off the armor.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you need that defensive system in order to make through it or to get through that. And a really good example of this kind of change that I played lately was from Lamantium. This was the 19th century pixel art style game. When we played the demo last summer, you had no defensive action. So what ended up happening was when you go to attack an enemy, by the time the attack animation finishes, even if you hit the enemy, they're already in melee range and they're going to hit you before you can actually respond. And there were cases in that game that you could, if you were, super pro at the game, you could time your swing just as the enemy entered your attack range so that it would hit them enough so you could get away. But that required a lot more action skill than I think what you would really want out of a survival horror game. Because again, survival horror is not Devil May Cry. Or is it? What do you think?
It may be. I mean, have you seen Devil May Cry?
Mm-hmm. But
I feel slow animations definitely do hinder a lot of stuff inside of action games.
Especially if they're uninterruptible. And for those of you who don't play action games and know what I'm talking about, in a lot of action-based designs, they will give you the ability to cancel or interrupt an animation depending upon where in that animation the character is in. So in some games, if I go to swing my sword, before the actual swing animation finishes, I can cancel that with a dodge or a block. In some games, you can dodge cancel anything. I've already swung my sword, it's down, and instead of waiting for me to lift the sword back up, I can just dodge out of the end of that animation and keep attacking.
Sounds kind of broken.
Oh, yes. And getting that feel where you want the player to feel like they are 100% in control of their action game. Because if they're not, and we've seen some games where you go to do an attack, and it's not just like a swinging a sword, it's like a 2-second long animation of the character wind up and then do the attack. That's not going to feel right when the player is trying to do that and 20 enemies just mob them and beat them up.
Although if it's a really powerful weapon, maybe. Like a rocket launcher or,
or like
a giant axe or, a buster sword or something like that kind of thing. But unless you're going to make up for it with raw damage numbers,
or if
that's probably a no-no.
Or if your heavy weapons give you super armor, that could be a different story as well.
Yeah.
Because nothing like winding up for a 2-second animation for one little hit, the 1 second, almost 99% done to cancel the whole animation.
Yeah.
And again, these are just some of the basic questions you have to ask when you're designing an action game. Because everything about an action game really stems from the first 2 to 5 minutes of playing that game. If those 2 to 5 minutes don't feel right in the player's hands, they're not going to stick around. This is not an RPG where you're supposed to be weak at the start and you're going to level up and get more gear and grow more powerful. No, you have to be really powerful at the start, and the enemies have to grow and compensate to match, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Although you can still get weapons and upgrades and stuff in action games.
Yeah. But you shouldn't be weak at the start. You shouldn't, feel like your character is, fighting with both hands behind their back for the first 5 hours of the experience.
I mean, what if that is literally the scenario? Is you're the enemies catch you and you have both hands tied behind your back and you have to fight that way.
Mm-hmm. Unless you're Dante, then you're good.
Well, if you're Dante, you're good. But if you're not Dante, not so much.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the more interesting aspects, that good action game design And we see this from 2D all the way to Souls-like. It's not about how the player grows. It's about how do the obstacles and enemies grow to challenge the player. And there are numerous ways that you can design action games along these lines. In a lot of my pieces and the books I've written, I talked about kind of rating enemies in terms of a tier list. Like, tier 1 are your fodder enemies, your zombies in Resident Evil, the basic necromorphs in Dead Space. Tier 2 would be kind of like the elites or lieutenants. Tier 3 would be like specialty enemies like range enemies, buffers, and stuff like that. And then tier 4 would be bosses. But you need to think about what kind of design is making up my action game, and how do I design enemies accordingly to compensate for that?
You always have to. Enemies are definitely a very important part and role in all games, but definitely, you have more of a flat progression in an action game versus like an RPG kind of thing. Because like an RPG, level 1, you're fighting people with stats like 3. Level 10, you're fighting with people with stats with probably like 200. Level 99, you're fighting people with stats like 9,999. Where in action games, you're at on the first level, you're probably fighting, I don't know, characters with stats like 5. And then, by the end, the final boss, you're probably fighting, him with stats like 11, 12, something like that. It's not as big of a ramp kind of thing, but there is, every one of those numbers matters way more than what the other ones do. But also, so do the attacks they use, because like, maybe, you have this character that only does, say he's does 8 damage. You're like, wow, that's 3 higher, almost that's like 1.5 times the base kind of thing. And you're like, okay, that enemy's really hard, but not necessarily. If he's really, really slow and his slow attacks and everything, he could be like one of the easiest enemies in the game. On the other hand, if you have this enemy over here, like, 4 damage, it's like, wait a minute, that's lower than the lowest, generally, the lowest of peons. But he has a, machine gun that has a rate of fire of like, a bullet, 3 or 4 bullets a second kind of thing, and he can just spray in an area kind of thing, then that is probably going to be pretty deadly. That might be final boss kind of territory kind of thing right there. So, like, it's not just the pure numbers, it's the moves and everything they do within it. And that's going to have a big factor of where they fit in your tier list.
But can they taunt in a splash, as we've seen in a few of the games that we've played? Yeah, but like Shark said, numbers are an important aspect, but so is the design of the enemy. For instance, like my tier 3 list of support class enemies. A support class enemy by itself is oftentimes meaningless. Oh, this archer can hit you, but if you're focused on 100%, you'll dodge every hit. But if that archer is mixed with 6 super fast sword wielding guys who are completely up in your face and you can't see that guy in the background, suddenly all those arrows in your back are going to prove to become more annoying. Or
the knee.
Yep. Or an enemy who can, is another pod one, the ever infamous enemy who gives all enemies an attack buff as long as they're on the field. It's always great when that one guy's like hidden, 40 feet that way, and all of his friends now do double damage, or they have hyper armor on top of that.
Yeah. And combos of enemies are important, not only for, changing tiers of enemies necessarily, but, they're they're important as of level design in an action game because, while, you may have a bunch of level 1 threats kind of thing, tier 1 threats, but when they're combined into a group in a specific combo kind of thing, that could change from a tier 1 fight to like a tier 4 fight kind of thing because just because of combos kind of thing. You can think about it, easy way to think about it is a CTG, here's a worthless card that does just, 1 damage kind of thing, 1 base damage, and then it adds in, whatever the strength of your character is, but then you have, a, power on there that says if used by a certain character and you have that character, you can now use it twice. And then you have a ability that weakens up the enemy so that it turns that base damage from 1 to 9. And now you're doing 9 twice versus 1 once, just from a few different combos of stuff that is very tame. So even tame stuff can combine into some monstrous stuff.
Yeah. And while it is technically a first-person shooter, a really great example of this is Doom Eternal. As Doom Eternal really borrowed a lot from the action genre in terms of its design and its enemy designs as well. That the enemies in Doom Eternal, they have their own tier list. They are graded in, light, medium, heavy, super heavy. They all have defined roles and behavior that they're going to throw out the player. And whatever combination that shows up during each phase radically changes the conversation as to what you're going to do during that fight. Getting one cyber demon by itself is scary. Getting one cyber demon, one what was his name, the Ravager or whatever the annoying guy with the sword and the shield is, plus a Archvile, my voice is dying, plus some Kako demons, and now it's masochism.
Your favorite thing.
Yeah. And you can see this again, like, that's one of the beauties and nightmares about action game design. How you put enemies together completely changes the levels. And
it can. It won't necessarily, because, like, if you have, for example, you have 3 different kinds of melee fighters kind of thing, and, they're all, have similar types of attacks, not the same attacks, but similar in there, to where, maybe one's got a sword, one's got a dagger, and one's got a lance kind of thing. The only thing different between them, for the most part, is just the range that they can reach with the melee kind of thing. For the most part, that doesn't change anything, no matter how you combo them together. But, when you have, like, a guy with a rocket launcher, that's staying the heck away, and you have a whole bunch of melee guys surrounding you so you can't get out of there, that vastly changes things. Maybe for the better, because if that rocket launcher has splash damage, then that means, like, when he hits you, he's also going to hit all his friends, and he may end up doing you a favor and killing most of them by just letting him hit you, sort of a damage boost, if you were,
Unless there is no friendly fire, then you're in big trouble.
Yeah.
But, like, you can see this with Doom Eternal, with not only going from the normal levels to the master levels, but also how they approach things in the 2 DLCs. In the review that I wrote for the DLCs, I did not like the first DLC for Doom Eternal. I felt that they ratcheted up so high in terms of difficulty that it just kind of became a mess in terms of what they threw at you. And that's the thing about action gameplay, is that what we're often talking about are seconds and at most minutes of very highly focused gameplay. So you're not thinking about your game in an action sense, as in, an 8 to 20 hour long game. You're thinking about these as, 2 to 3 minute long arena fights, 1 to 3 minutes of, moving from point A to point B, and what is going on in those sections. Because it is very easy to kind of over design an action game and just make things too over the top that it becomes a frustration to play.
Here's a question for you.
Hmm?
What do you think about games that take that kind of formula, but instead of doing it in 2 or 3 minute sections kind of thing, they put it in like a 15, 20 minute section?
That's kind of that's when it gets really tough for action games because the more the player has to repeat a section or the more weight to it, the more frustrating it is to die and have to do it all over again. In
Not to
Doom
mention it gets
repetitive.
what's the term? No, not repetitive. I was talking about exhausting.
Yeah.
Exhausting because you're not giving the player a break between, they get a break when they die. That
You break when you die. You break when you're
Yeah.
dead. That's game development right there.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
a AAA game development.
And there's a fundamental difference in terms of pacing by saying, okay, here are 3 encounters that are 5 minutes long versus one encounter that is 15 minutes long. Because if I die during encounter 2, well, I can replay at encounter 2. If I die 10 minutes into your 15-minute encounter, then I have to repeat those last 10 minutes over again. And that was one of the issues I had with the Doom Eternal 1 DLC, that they raise the time and the amount of each encounter. So instead of it being maybe 1 to 3 waves per arena, it's now like 3 to 6. So that if I make it to wave 6 and I die, I gotta replay those last 5 waves over again. It becomes, I think, a little bit more of like a Kaizo game, where, if you don't do it 100% right, if you are only 95% good, well, you gotta repeat the whole thing all over again.
You gotta get good.
Yep. And
Mike asked, isn't action a lot more than just violent in FPS? I mean, FPS would be like a different genre entirely.
Yeah, but the reason why I'm talking about Doom Eternal is that Doom Eternal is very much a case of a game borrowing action game elements. Because a lot of action games design their enemies not as just bullet or sword sponges, but they define essential roles for them. You'll have an enemy who is designed to just kind of, they'll move around very fast or only go in for pot shots when they know they get hit. You have, larger enemies who are just going to charge you. You have backup enemies. It's not just throwing, it would be like this between Serious Sam. In Serious Sam, the common AI behavior of all the enemies is rush the player and shoot at them. Or, yell and scream with a kamikaze's approach. In an action game, you are defining enemies to do different things. So that it is a fundamental different experience if an enemy group is made up of, let's say, type B, C, and D versus L, M, and N.
Yeah. Doom is a FPS with a side of action kind of thing.
Specifically Doom Eternal. That's the one that kind of really leaned into that.
Yeah, and it leaned into action more than the others did, for sure.
And so did something like Ultra Kill, and maybe even Dread Templar that we played. But those are definitely more exceptions to the FPS rule than what we've seen normally.
Yeah, which FPS is a completely different topic, but we're referring to the action side of it.
Mm-hmm.
And, but I mean, action is a lot about violence and the feel of it, and, we said that, one branch off of action, which we're not going to get into today, is like beat 'em ups and such.
Yep.
And fighting games.
Oh, yes.
But like action games like Metal Slug, and all kinds of other games are just, it's all about the violence and the feel of it,
Yep.
Not saying that you can't make an action game without violence, but I mean, I can't think of a good example of that. A good action game that doesn't have violence in it.
Yep, I mean, action is in the title. Unless you
Yeah,
do
I
maybe
mean,
a hug 'em up. Go like that a clown game that goes like his whole goal is he wants to hug everyone in the town. But
do you gotta hug your enemies to death?
that would have been a very different experience for that game.
Well, it is what it is because like you hug the enemies until their HP goes down to 0, and then they love you, right? You hugged them to death.
There you go. But so much about action gameplay and why it is a hard genre to design is that, again, you need to not only get the feel of your character right, you also need to design levels and obstacles that make sense or make use of that. And you also need to design enemies that can properly challenge the player. And so much about this, it's very easy, like we said, to go over the top. Like, how about an enemy that has hyper armor, attacks 5 times faster than your animations, and every time you try and hit him, he just recovers health? That's a challenge, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, wait, no challenge there. It is easy. All you have to do is get good.
Yeah. In the Splatterhouse revival that was for the 360 and I think PlayStation 3, they introduced an enemy that if you don't notice this enemy, it will one-shot kill you, or it will one-shot take you down to essentially you're like one hit away from dying. But the fun part is that it is the exact same model as other enemies. It's just that this one is, tinted red, while the other ones are maybe tinted green. So good luck paying attention to that when you're splattering blood all over the place, and this guy just comes up behind you and just instantly kills you.
Are we ready to move on to 3D action games now?
I think so. I'm trying to think if there's anything else specifically like 2D related, and it's again one of those genres. I think the 2D side has then become kind of the mantra of modern retro developers and fans.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're trying to do 2D original today, I think that is a far harder sell. Because a lot of what made the evolution of 2D gameplay has been the adoption of, the action-adventure side, the Metroidvania, taking from other genres and applying it.
Mm-hmm. Although I think somebody could make a new game that's along the lines of Metal Slug and be pretty good off.
Yep.
If they executed right, had the good art and everything else.
I would say allowing maybe on that line of action adventure. What would you think?
I don't know. I hadn't played that one.
Yeah, because it had combat to it, but it was still very much a platformer. And again, a lot of 2D action. Yeah, maybe action platformer or action adventure, something along those lines. A lot of the 2D
was it more platformer or more action than Mega Man?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say it's more platformer, but not by much. It again, like the problem with 2D is that 2D was so predominant because it touched so many different genres and subgenres. Now, when we got to 3D, though, things became far more defined in terms of what genre a game is.
Yeah.
And
which in 3D we had great examples like Devil May Cry, which is what I use for my thumbnail. I love Devil May Cry 3. I hate that it's so damn hard, but I have nearly beaten it on every difficulty level.
You gotta get good at getting those triple S's.
Yeah.
Yep. 3D action is kind of where the genre blew up. And it's kind of the second era of when we talk about action games. So, again, this is the era of Devil May Cry, God Hand, Bayonetta, God of War. A lot of gods had to do with action games. And
yeah.
when
gods are full of action, right?
Yep. Unless it's the god of sleeping.
God of Sleeping is still, killing a lot of people in his dreams.
There you go.
Everybody's killing people in their dreams
But
or nightmares. But like mechanically, there's not a whole lot of difference between 2D and 3D action games. But the perspective and everything and the feel of everything completely changes, very, very abruptly kind of thing, despite the mechanics not really changing all that much.
Mm-hmm. But there is a greater focus on depth when we get to 3D. This is when...
because of the third dimension and now you actually have real depth?
Yeah. You have more space to work with the mechanics. And this is, again, the same thing we saw with 3D platformers, specifically the Mario side of things. That, given that extra dimension, you can now do a lot more. You can have dodges, left and right. You can do a lot more in terms of movement tech. Bubsy 3, exactly. Mm-hmm. And it also opened up the door for different kinds of attacks. You can now have attacks that are more focused on length, like a spear. You can have, wider swings. You can have, the ever popular, double-handed axe, super wind up, just like slam it down and hit everyone in like a small AoE. And
AoE attacks are hard, very next to impossible to do right in 2D, but in 3D, they're really good. I mean, you can definitely do them in 2D. It just doesn't have the same impact, I guess you would say, as a 3D, because you're only doing an area effect in two directions versus three, and it could also be round. It could be star shaped. There's all kinds of different things, because if you take a round or a star shaped kind of thing and you translate that into 2D, they're both identical. Yeah. But in a 3D environment, they are very, very different.
Yeah, like I guess like my first real exposure to 3D action would be the Dynasty Warriors games. I remember playing the original Dynasty Warriors on PlayStation 2. I remember I was looking at that it was a kiosk at GameStop back in the day. And like the first time you do a Muso attack, where all of a sudden your character just starts like swinging his swords and like 37 guys get like sent flying backwards. And hello, Bit Ben.
Hey, Bit Ben. Yeah, that just the feel from a 3D action game has this a very, very different, and I would say almost a more visceral feel to it, because it's you can get more visceral feeling kind of thing in a 3D environment, because like when you're talking about like knockback and stuff like that, when you're talking about knockback in 2D, it's just the character moving slightly back kind of thing, a couple pixels kind of thing, and on maybe either side of you kind of thing. Where you're talking about 3D kind of thing, you could arc around and knock back hundreds of guys in like a game like that, and it's just a very different, more visceral feeling, and also, I mean, you have stuff that could knock back in certain directions. You have like cones, you have like half cones, you have all kinds of different area of effects kind of thing, where a cone in a 2D game, a 3D game, would be a lot of different area kind of thing. But when you have on a 2D game, that's just the same as a a half square,
Yeah. And another thing that I think 3D brought that in a kind of ironic twist would then be adopted by more 2D games later was this sense of being able to combo transition. That it wasn't just like we played a lot of early 2D action games, especially the beat 'em up genre. You always had those cases where you do an attack and that attack is kind of separate. Like you can't do anything else beyond that move. But with like games like Devil May Cry, what we saw later with Fight and Rage, there was this idea that, okay, I do my whole combo, and then I can jump at the enemy and continue into a new combo. And I can just, as anyone who's played Devil May Cry, you can do like the infinite upswing. You know, you just keep knocking the enemy up in the air, follow through before he hits the ground, just hit him back up again. It's the Marvel versus Capcom strategy of the infinite combo. And
yeah,
it's
but fighting games are on that. You know, even 2D fighting games, which or beat 'em ups rather, are on that territory where they're not quite 2D kind of thing. They're simulated 3D because you have
the different plane.
You have 3 planes of movement kind of thing. Because you can move left to right, you move up to down, and then you can actually move in the air too. You know, like when you're talking about a Streets of Rage or a what was the other one?
Fighting Rage,
Battletoads,
so on. Yeah,
and which are 2D that are simulating 3D, and a lot of the aspects of 3D will actually translate over to them. But beat 'em ups and fighting games are a topic for later.
Yeah. So with like 3D action, with the rise of Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, and so on, it really for the audience watching this right now live recorded, it's easy to think oh, it's all so tamed, and Devil May Cry is like going back to like a 1930s car. Like driving that instead of like a modern day car. But when Devil May Cry 1 came out, that was groundbreaking for a lot of people. Like, we didn't have action games at that level of fluidity and that visceral nature before, up until that game.
Oh, and then when you add into Devil May Cry 3, that was a whole nother level because when I remember the first time I played Devil May Cry 3, it was so amazing because I accidentally jumped on top of one of the enemies and then I just started skating around. I was like, "Oh my god!"
Yeah,
and then not only were you skating around, but I'm sitting there shooting while I'm skating around, and then I can spin while I'm shooting and all kinds of other stuff. And there's like this whole new set of movement tech the second you get on there, and it's like, holy crap.
Yeah. I mean, for me, like, my top 3 action games are still Ninja Gaiden Black, God Hand, and Devil May Cry 3. And I still haven't seen a modern-day action game, I think, really go more than what those 3 games did. Like, there's definitely this...
Bayonetta did.
I was just about to say Bayonetta is, like... Bayonetta's close. I think I would maybe rank that, like, 4th on my list. But, again, part of the reason why those 3 games worked was just getting that feel of combat right. And, again, with Devil May Cry, such a fascinating way of how they were able to build it. And again, like, as the story goes, Devil May Cry originally started as Resident Evil 4. That they were building a Resident Evil 4 is going to be more action-focused, more like demon-focused. And they just said, it's not really Resident Evil. Why don't you go do something else with it? And that turned into Devil May Cry.
I thought that turned into Resident Evil, what was it, 6, 7?
No, that was 4. It was a long time ago. Again,
No. You missed the joke there. Yeah. What was it? Was it 6 or 7 that they did that with?
Probably 6. And 5 was Boulder
Punching. On action that everybody hated.
But with pure action games, or with the rise of 3D action, we began to see this template of there's always like these 2 different sides of 3D action games. There are those that focus predominantly on very narrow, you're fighting one-on-one enemies at a time, versus the more chaotic, I swing my sword and I can guarantee hit at least 5 guys with that swing. Or, in God of War's case, my sword's on chains that are tied around my wrists. What did you think of God of War, if you had a chance to play that? The originals, not 2018.
I don't think I ever played the first one. I played some of a little bit of the later ones. I mean, I liked it, but at the same time, it wasn't my cup of tea. At the same time, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I never put a lot of time into it, but I do definitely very much respect what they've done because, like, their combat system does feel quite good in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
You know, especially like the quick time events at the end. I mean, those can go either way, kind of thing, depending on how you feel about quick time events.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like for me, the problem with God of War and what kind of like relegated a lot of action games to like B and C tier for me was that it just felt combat was too repetitive. That I could just do the same attack every time and I would win 99% of the fights. Like, if you've watched a lot of people who play action games, including myself, one of my more popular strategies is to always use, the super heavy, does like 3 times more damage attack. And, I'll just stun lock an enemy with it, rinse and repeat for most of the fights.
Well, maybe that's the reason why I never played them for a long period of time.
Yeah, and that
Because
was
maybe it got repetitive and I just quit before the repetitive fully caught on, kind of thing.
yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I like Ninja Gaiden and Devil May Cry. That it had so much of a high skill curve that you really couldn't just repeat the same attack over again. In Ninja Gaiden in particular, enemies had unblockable throws that they would do massive damage. So basically, standing still in Ninja Gaiden equaled death. So did standing still in Devil May Cry too.
Mike's asked, can you have action without violence in combat? Without violence? Yeah. Without combat? I don't think so.
Yeah, like action games again, they are reflex driven. So there has to be something for the player to be doing in them.
Yeah, you have to be reflexing to something. It has to be a quote unquote enemy kind of thing. Now, whether that enemy is, I don't know, if the enemy is like somebody who needs a hug kind of thing, and your job is to spread love and hug people kind of thing, you need to hug them until their HP goes down and they become friendly.
Yeah. I mean, we could, if we want to like stretch the definition, we could put something like Cook Serve Delicious in the action category. It is a very reflex based game. It's just reflex by typing than mashing buttons.
That falls more into the casual game, the hardcore casual, mind you.
Is that safely extreme?
Yes, that is definitely safely extreme.
Mm-hmm.
Because I definitely wouldn't classify it as an action game. I mean, like, it has some aspects of action kind of thing, but a lot of there's many casual games that do. Not all of them, but there's many of them that do. So, like, I wouldn't put that in the action category, but like, if you just had obstacles kind of thing and no like quote unquote enemies, then you got a platformer at that point. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like you need again.
You've got to be fighting something.
Like the platformer genre, platforming design really intersected so much of the game industry that for a lot of people it's hard to kind of, differentiate a game that has jumping as a mechanic versus a platforming where jumping is a major obstacle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like, are you thinking of games like Banjo-Kazooie, Jet Force Gemini, Blast Corps? I like Blast Corp. Like, that was one of my favorites. I'm surprised we haven't seen anyone else try to do something else along those lines.
Well, Banjo is a 3D platformer.
Yeah. Blast Corp was a Destruct'em Up, as you had to just wreck cities. Or, like, Space Station Silicon Valley. Like, again, there's a lot that you can kind of, look at and take apart when it comes to 3D platforming and 3D action games along those lines. Yeah, Blast Corp, one of my favorites.
I'm
Getting
not
back,
familiar with that one.
oh yeah, you should watch the GDQ of it. It's a very fascinating game. Like there really hasn't been anything else like it.
Hmm.
Uh, with 3D action, one of the problems, I think, what kind of led to this greater adoption of Souls-like elements was, again, the high barrier of entry. When we talk about the action genre, even when we talk about easy mode in an action game, it still has a high skill curve.
Yeah,
Like we,
it has a high skill floor.
yeah, and it's also why that genre attracted a lot of hardcore fans. That it takes skill to get good at a game like Devil May Cry or God of War or Bayonetta, and you can really show off in those games.
Which now I think that's a perfect transition into Souls games.
Mm-hmm. And as
Because
a
Souls games are very much a
hybrid,
action game, but they have they're more um they're more precise in how they do their reflex stuff. You've got to time
mm-hmm.
your blocks. You've got to block. You know, a lot of
Yeah,
action games didn't even have blocks. You know,
yeah.
some of them
And
did.
as a quick time check, we are about an hour and 10 in. So you think maybe another 15 minutes should be good?
Probably.
Okay. So yeah, with the rise of Souls-likes or Souls-like design, it's basically defined by two very important points. One, as Shark said, was this slowing down of action. That it's not about high speed play anymore. Like you cannot play a Souls like the same way as you would play a Ninja Gaiden or a Devil May Cry. They're just, completely incompatible in that respect. We even saw this with Neo. That Neo may be the fastest of the Souls-like kind of gameplay, but it's still, it still feels like a snail if we put it next to Devil May Cry 5 or any of the Devil May Cries.
Mm-hmm.
The other aspect has been this greater adoption of RPG systems and progression. Like Shark said earlier, like there's a reason why these games adopted RPG systems. Like they work really damn well to keep you invested in these games. So
So you would say Souls like is a less actiony action game with more precision and RPG mechanics.
kind of, yeah. It's just that simple. But yeah, like what we saw with again the Souls-like focus has been kind of lowering the skill ceiling of these games and the skill floor as well, but replacing that with RPG progression. If you are not really good at blocking in a Souls like, well, build a high dodge build. If you're not good at dodging, build a high, tanky armor build. In an action game, if you're not good at dodging, you're dead. It's just that simple.
Yeah, I prefer action games that don't have a block or a dodge, and they're built, where your way of avoiding it is just getting out of the way,
Mm-hmm.
sidestepping it, or running away or whatever, like a beat 'em up kind of thing that doesn't have a block
Mm-hmm.
or a dodge, kind of thing. I prefer that kind of thing because like I hate having a separate I hate having buttons attached to movement. That's sort of like a mental glitch that I can't get out of because whenever there is movement attached to a button kind of thing, outside of like a gas pedal or something for a car,
Mm-hmm.
I can't get behind it. But that's not really movement to a lot of extent. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
But
with
I prefer
Soulslike,
the not having buttons attached to movement stuff.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and with Souls likes, with that slowing down of kind of the movement and combat, they pretty much require you to have those additional defensive options. And
Mhm.
what Shark was saying earlier about, having to time your animations, like that's where, animation buffering becomes a very big role. That, if you're swinging your sword and if you hit the attack button during that first attack animation, your character, as soon as he's done swinging, will just swing again. So if you're just mashing attack, and let's say the enemy starts rearing up for his, mighty smashdown, you're going to still be attacking as he crushes your head in and does, half your health bar.
Yeah, and that's the reason why I don't play Souls games. That and the block and any kind of movement tech attached to buttons.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and the reason, like, the genre really moved towards this way, or moved towards Souls-likes, was again the fact that it reduced, like, even though people will argue and complain, Dark Souls needs a difficulty setting, Dark Souls is too hard, Dark Souls is not accessible, it is arguably far more accessible than Devil May Cry was, than the original God of War was. And it's just, again, that different flavor of action design.
Yeah, it's not accessible to me because of the button-based movement tech
Mm-hmm.
and such.
But it did offer a chance for more people to play these action games because again you have that RPG progression or the RPG systems that can augment and circumvent player skill. Again, if I'm not the best player, I can rely on heavy armor. When I first played Dark Souls, when I got to the Four Kings fight, I basically put on a Havel set, fat rolled my way around, and just tanked all the damage. When I replayed the game, what was that?
The counter to that would be when you have an RPG system that makes you weaker
Hmm.
and ruins your build, and we've seen that very much with Sekiro.
Mm-hmm.
With
Or even
the
with games that have like forced RPG progression, like God of War 2018, where if you are 4 levels or higher, less than the enemy, skill means nothing. They will one shot and kill you every time.
Mm,
And I think good design, good action, good Souls like design in this regard, is giving players the ability to punch up, to, fight higher than their weight class. That if someone is really good at dodging, who's really good at doing reposes and parries, let them fight an enemy 10 levels above them, get that extra rare loot, get that extra great stuff. Don't just say, oh, the enemy's 5 levels above you, all your stats are now 80% less when you fight this enemy just because.
yep.
And,
And that doesn't just apply to action games for that
mm-hmm,
matter. I put that in my tactical RPG, my last game, the old word of the day, Chromasia,
mm-hmm,
because like I set a minimum damage that you could deal to enemies that you would unless it was a very final boss kind of thing, you would never encounter you did 0 damage.
mm-hmm,
You would do very low. I think it was something like 10% of their HP. So no matter what it was, you would kill any character in 10 hits. But if you were so weak that all your characters were taking that kind of thing, there's basically no chance of you winning. But there is a chance of you killing a few of those enemies versus if it was just hard stats and you could deal 0
mm-hmm.
kind
And
of
this
thing. So it
is.
was allowed accessibility kind of thing. And since we allowed people to cape EXP after a every kill kind of thing, it did you know build into that skill for lowering it.
Mm-hmm. And we also saw this as even more games adopted RPG based systems like the Assassin's Creeds, Far Cry's, and so on. Where, in the first Assassin's Creed game, if you get that perfect sneak up on that, heavily armored guard, you can one shot stealth kill him. In the latest Assassin's Creed game, you get that perfect, stealth on a guy who's 10 levels above you, and your knife to the back of his head will just tickle him. Or in like the Division, where you can unload a assault rifle into a guy's face, and it'll just do 1 point of damage each time, because that is entirely realistic, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, like,
or don't forget Marvel's Avengers, when you can have the Hulk punch a robot full force, and he does 5 points of damage.
Oh yeah, that's exactly what the Hulk does.
Mm-hmm.
It's Hulk gently touched with pinky.
Yeah. But even like
his
Hulk
smash, it's Hulk gently touched with pinky.
Well, I'm pretty sure his pinky could still like maim a few people. Just like go like this and just smack them with his pinky.
No, gently.
Gently. But gently would still like at least like push you back like a few feet, right?
Yeah, I mean he did that to Black Widow a few times, I think. But like that makes perfect sense. I mean, you wouldn't want a Hulk that did Hulk smashes or anything like that. I mean, that would be out of character for him.
Hulk hug.
Yeah.
There you go.
A Hulk hug him up.
Mm-hmm. But the adoption of RPG elements to action games became or has been a major focus of these designs. Because again, when you have RPG systems, it allows for a far longer progression curve. Again, the beauty and problem of traditional action games is that it is entirely focused on the skill floor and the skill ceiling based on the player's reflexes. If you are not able to get like this good at a game in an action title, you're done. There is no, grinding, there's no leveling up that you can do. In a game that has RPG levels and gear to it, if you can't get to this level with your skill, well, go craft better armor, upgrade your weapons, get a better spell. And those things will circumvent the need for skill. And again,
only to a point, though.
To a point. But some of the games just kind of let you get away with that. I've seen people who are horrible at soulslikes, and all they'll do is just wear, the most OP armor, use the most OP spell, and spam that. And there's no need to dodge, there's no need to properly time. You just kind of coast through the entire game.
I suck at Souls, and I went in there and I could not get anywhere. And I got really frustrated really quickly.
You didn't find the OP stuff, that's the problem.
The problem might have been that I was playing a demo or something at a lock point, and there was no option for me to do anything other than go fight this one enemy, and if you can't get past this one enemy, you're done. And I could never get past that one enemy. I fought him like 20 or 30 times.
Yeah. And what's kind of interesting about kind of the change into the Souls-likes is that I think the Souls-likes have really robbed a lot of these games of having interesting enemy variety. Because of those RPG layers, it's kind of like, oh, there's a new enemy, but my weapon's, plus 10, so I'm just going to slice him the same way as this other enemy. Other than boss fights, I think boss fights in Souls-likes definitely, I think, elevated compared to a lot of boss fights in traditional action games. With exceptions, of course.
Mm-hmm. There's some pretty over-top bosses in action games.
Virgil, Devil May Cry 3 is still one of the standouts.
As are some of like these mech fights and ship fights in some of these action games.
But yeah,
where you've got to, they have like tons of different parts, and you've got to destroy parts to disable some of their weapons, and then some of them might be self-repairing and all this other stuff. And it's one of those things where there's, you're comboing enemies together essentially. You know what I mean? So like like when you have like the archer, the tank, and the mage kind of thing fighting you all at the same time, it's also kind of the same thing when you have a giant machine or ship or something that has all these different weapons on it that all do, or maybe not all of them, but they do different things.
Yeah.
And kind of combining together.
It's so weird about kind of that split that when we talk about pure action games, so much of what makes them work is about designing the player. While for a lot of Souls-likes, so much of what makes them work is about designing memorable boss fights. Again, like Bloodborne being like one of the quintessential examples. And we haven't, I think, really seen, at least in the last like few years, a game that has married them both, I think, really well. We could argue maybe Neo, but I still felt that Neo wasn't perfect in terms of its action gameplay.
You wouldn't say Devil May Cry?
Well, in the last few years. Like, Devil May Cry 3, yes. I'm not so sure about Devil May Cry 5. Like, I didn't fall in love with the one as much as everyone else did.
I haven't played 5.
Mm-hmm.
Only 3, 4, and then I went back and played, I think it was 1 that I went back and played. But I didn't get to beat it.
Mm-hmm.
Because it wasn't mine. I was borrowing it or something.
But again, when it comes to good action gameplay, it really, I think this will be like my final thoughts for our topic. It really comes down to how do you design your character, how do you design the space or the environment around that character, and how do you design the enemies to counter that character. There's a reason why I'm really excited about Ultra Kill, as Ultra Kill really borrows a lot of those same principles as Doom Eternal. And it's very interesting, again, that if you're going to do pure action or do focusing on action, it really comes down to just, again, what makes that moment-to-moment pop. And if it doesn't, you don't really have a good action game.
Yep. Is there anything we haven't covered yet?
We talked enemy designs. I mean, we could certainly talk about boss designs, but I think that may be... I don't know, that may be a little...
Not really in this topic.
Yeah, like, boss designs could probably... Like, designing a good boss could be maybe its own cast, because we could touch a lot of different genres with it. I guess anything on your side that we didn't cover?
Not that I can think of.
Yeah. And again, like, the action genre in of itself, just like platformers, really intersected with a lot of different genres. So it kind of makes it hard to just talk about it and nothing else.
Yeah, but we pulled it off.
Yeah. Did we get a triple S or did we just get a or B?
I got a triple S, you got a D.
Ah. But I think we did come up with the next genre craze, the hug 'em up. I think that should be your next game after Neon Continuum.
Maybe.
But
our next cast will be about Metroidvania and action adventure, which ties right into this show.
Yeah.
And the one after that would be fighting games and beat 'em ups, which also ties into this one. Yeah. So the next 2 shows are going to tie in directly to everything we talked about in this cast.
Oh, yes. And I'm sure it will intersect with everything just like these last ones have done. Just because, again, we're talking about a lot of bread and butter genres of the game industry. When we get further into the series and get into some more specific ones, like survival horror, shmups, FPSs, that's when we'll start to see, I think, far more divides in terms of our conversations.
Yeah, because right now we're talking about more core genres right now, at least reflex wise, and we're Metrovania and action adventure is going to be more specific, as is fighting games and beat 'em ups, which is very hard not to talk about in this one.
Yes, definitely. Fighting games, yeah.
Fighting games.
And we do have to have, I think, Simulator on the list. Although I think Simulator may be a very quick one. Because it's just basically, did you make your game just like flying an airplane or driving a car? Yes/no.
I think we might have them.
Huh? We will check. So, for tonight, I'm going to be starting... great.
It's in there with racing.
Nice. Tonight, I'll be starting Trails in the Skies, the second chapter. And if you are new, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that we've talked about.
Yep. And check the links below. There will be links to my Discord, Josh's Discord, and both of our YouTube channels as well as other stuff. And join my Discord to be able to check out my current game, Neon Continuum, which is a really cool grid-based CCG.
Yeah, see my next.
Got a cyberpunk and neon focus.
Yep. And if you want to catch these shows live, we do them Sundays at 4 p.m. ET on both of our respective channels. If you would like to suggest topics for future shows, store pages for us to review, things like that, let us know in the comments.
Yep, and make sure to lick the smash button and smash the like button on both of our channels.
All right. So with that said, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Until next time, take care.